I'd like to talk about yarn dominance today, which is an effect that occurs whenever you work with more than one yarn in a row or a round. And the yarn which is dominant is the one that strands below the other. Now this doesn't have anything to do with intarsia, where you would work one yarn and then drop it and pick up another yarn. This occurs when you are stranding two yarns across the piece, taking turns. And so one yarn always falls below the other, and that bottom yarn is the one that will create the dominant effect. Now that's a little confusing because we think of dominant as on top, but in this case it is the yarn, the dominant yarn is the one that's below the other yarn, the non-dominant yarn. And so how it's dominant is how it shows up in the knitting. It actually makes a larger presence in the knitting. And so if you looked at it very carefully, you would see that the dominant yarn creates a stitch that originates below the other stitch. And so the yarn has to go from that lower point all the way around the needle and back down to that origination point before it goes on to create the next stitch. And that little bit of extra yarn creates the larger stitch. There's an added benefit to keeping dominance in mind as you work, and that is that because one yarn stays below and one yarn stays above the whole time, your yarns won't get twisted. I'd like to show some examples that will illustrate good technique and some poor technique too in terms of dominance. So you'll see that some of the pieces that aren't done as well have a more muddied look, or even they look like they have a mistake in them because the stitches are out of sync with each other in terms of size. So I hope that you'll enjoy this video. For our first example of yarn dominance, we're going to look at these socks based on the Swedish Ullared sweater. And you can see that one sock looks more black and one looks more red. And this has to do with how the yarns were stranded as these socks were being knitted. If we look closely, we can see this effect if you look at the little stitch inside the diamond. So if we look at the red diamonds, the black stitch is much larger in the blacker sock, where the black is dominant, and the black is smaller in the red sock, where the black is non-dominant. Now if we look at the stripes where the colors are reversed, in the red sock, where the red is dominant, you can see that the red stitch in the middle of the black diamond is larger than in the black dominant sock. And there, the little red stitch is smaller because it's non-dominant in the black sock. So imagine if you are knitting along and you inadvertently switch your yarns, you'll be able to see that, and there's nothing to be done except to rip it out or just live with it. The next example I'd like to show are these Norwegian mittens. And they look pretty much the same until we take a closer look. Do you see how the Norwegian star on the left mitten is more robust looking than the star or snowflake in the right mitten? And so in the left mitten, the gold yarn is held in the dominant position and the green yarn is held in the non-dominant position. For the right mitten, the opposite is true. The gold is held in the non-dominant position and the green is held in the dominant position. So in both mittens, the green is the background and the gold is the pattern coloring. You want to hold the pattern color in the dominant position, which is underneath the other yarn, the non-dominant yarn, so that your patterning shows up more. I show this swatch in most of my classes to illustrate the dominance. So in this first line, you can see it's
Knit 2 red, knit 2 gray, knit 2 red, knit 2 gray. And the gray is the dominant yarn. You can see that it is originating below where the red stitch begins. And that's because it's longer. And you can see on the wrong side, the gray is stranding underneath the red. So the gray is dominant and the red is non-dominant. With the next row, you can see that the red originates lower than the gray, and the red is dominant in this row. And sure enough, the red is stranding below the gray, and the gray is non-dominant. Now the third line is curious because we've mixed it up. And so let's look on the wrong side and see what happened. Well, right here, the red is dominant and the gray is non-dominant, but right here, the gray becomes dominant because the dominance was switched, and the red becomes non-dominant. In this last example, I'm showing a sweater I knitted long ago, which is based on the Swedish North Holland pullover. And you can see that at the bottom part where I was trying to practice stranding with 2 yarns in my left hand, there's a big problem. I did not know how to properly hold the yarns, so they kept twisting around each other, which caused this variance in the dominance and in the tension. And once I realized that, I went back to holding the yarns one in each hand, and you can see that that looks a lot better. So fortunately, when I went to Scandinavia, I was taught a wonderful trick that helped me to do much better holding yarns in my left hand. And I will show that in a later video. I hope it was helpful for you, seeing projects that illustrate good technique and poor technique in stranding to keep dominance consistent. In the following videos that I'll be posting, you can see how to make a certain yarn dominant by merely holding it in a certain position. So I'll show different ways of stranding. For instance, 2 yarns in the right hand for English knitters, 2 yarns in the left hand for continental knitters, and a yarn in each hand too. The bottom yarn will always be dominant, but depending upon the style in which you knit, that varies how you'll hold it. Thanks for watching.